It's an honor and a pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, a scholar whose work I admire and whose friendship I cherish. Rhiannon Noel Welch is an assistant professor of Italian and cinema studies at Rutgers University. Her studies of Italian literature and film integrate biopolitical, psychoanalytic, and postcolonial theory into breathtaking readings of great nuance and consequence. Her writing has appeared in National Belongings, L'Italia Postcoloniale, Analisi Italianistica, Italica, and the Acts of Italian Theory Existo, and in the forthcoming Italian Mobilities. Rhiannon has translated Roberto Esposito's Terms of the Political, Community, Immunity, Biopolitics, as well as essays by Antonio Negri and Gabriele D'Annunzio. Her manuscript, Vital Subjects, Race and Biopolitics in Italy, which is under contract with Liverpool University Press's new imprint on transnational Italian cultures, is a monumental work that examines the biopolitical foundations of Italian racial discourse. Her talk this evening is entitled Haunting and the Postcolonial Ethics of the Gaze. Please join me in welcoming Rhiannon Welch.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone, for coming here tonight on this miserable, weather-wise, miserable evening. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here. As Rebecca mentioned, my most recent work is the book manuscript that I've just completed. So 19th century, heavily textual, biopolitical stuff. And this tonight represents the beginnings of a new project. So I'd like to just make it abundantly clear that this is new material for me. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I really look forward to getting some feedback. And I appreciate your patience as I struggle through some stuff. Okay, so last June, after a month-long residency at a Rome-based contemporary art organization, Danish sculptor and video artist Nikolaj Larsen dropped 48 figures evocative of human shapes wrapped in concrete. Is this better? Wrapped in concrete canvas, resembling funerary sheets and body bags, into the Tyrrhenian Sea near the Calabrian town of Pizzo. The human forms were to serve as markers of the tens of thousands of unidentified dead bodies of refugees and asylum seekers washing up on Italy's shores and enshrouded in anonymous sheets by Italian authorities, making of the Mediterranean in recent years, rather than a source of life, what some have ominously dubbed a vast necro-region. Larsen's figures deliberately recalled the now ubiquitous images disseminated by the international press. The figures were affixed to a wooden so these are the now ubiquitous images disseminated by the international press, not the artwork. The figures were affixed to a wooden platform with ropes and chains, hanging vertically like macabre pendulums. Like specters, they occupied a liminal space between surface and depth, at once present and absent, material and fleeting, visible and invisible, fixed and mobile, past and present. The plan for the work, titled End of Dreams, was to keep the 48 figures submerged in the sea for 4 months, incurring variously erosion, a degradation of their form, and presumably the growth of new subaqueous forms of life, a filmy coating of algae, a host for other marine organisms. After several months, Larsen planned to remove the forms, exhibiting them publicly, similar to an earlier precursor work on trans-Aegean migration that premiered at the Thessaloniki Biennale in 2001 and was titled Ode to the Perished. An unexpected storm interrupted his plan for the work as the platform was ripped asunder, reduced to shards, and most of the 48 sculptures were detached from their anchors and cast further out to sea. The metaphorical implications of this chance meteorological event were, of course, not lost on Larson. He tracked down a local art student and diver, Giuseppe Paoliti, who went in search of the figures with an underwater HD camera. The resulting video installation is a haunting work, indelibly inscribed with the very perilous conditions it seeks to reveal and denounce. Only about half of the original sculptures were recovered. The fragmented remainders, like the human bodies they were meant to memorialize, presumably lie in obscurity somewhere on the sea floor. So for Larson, cinema intervenes to register the spectral vestiges, the ruins of a commemorative project, something like the afterlife of memory. That chance and contingency brought about his cinematic intervention adds another layer of spectrality to the work, given the connections between photographic media and the spectral as time out of joint, in Derrida's words, at once present and absent, material and immaterial. We can trace this link from its literal formulation in 19th century postmortem and spirit photography through to Barth, Benjamin, and Pasolini. Rather than an attempt to reconstruct or capture the individual lives lost, as Larson has in previous works, activating photography's honorific function, in Alan Sekula's words, the commemoration of the dead here is collective, anonymous. The work can thus be read as much of a as this always trips me up, as much a commemoration as a condemnation of the would-be host country and its politics of categorical exclusion and rejection. The figure's only vague resemblance to human shapes and their ultimate anonymity are thus critical elements of Larson's ethical project. Like Derrida's ghost, Larson's figures demand to be heeded, listened to. They signify an ethical and political potential. They are figures that escape full cognition. As haunting figures, they produce, in Avery F. Gordon's words, quote, a something to be done. Larson's piece brings up a series of issues that I'd like to work through in my comments tonight, which depart a little bit from the abstract that I circulated this evening about the status of the trace in cinematic attempts to come to terms with Italy's colonial past and the search to reestablish an ethics of the gaze in the wake of colonial violence and objectification. I'd like to bring two films together, separated by just over a decade, by Pasolini and Gianni and Ricciardi, because they share an attempt to define an ethical way of looking at colonial subjects and landscapes in the aftermath of empire. If the most urgent task of any purportedly anti-colonial film is to disempower or at the very least problematize the objectifying gaze of the camera, given the multiple and well-documented links between colonial desire, governmentality, and visual media, these films each address this representational problem by deliberately deploying the spectral. What prompted my interest in these texts was that it seems to me several decades before postcolonial Italian studies began deploying the notion of haunting to describe Italy's relationship to its colonial past, films by Pasolini and Gianni and Ricciardi formulate compelling calls to engage the traces of colonialism in spectral terms. It's become commonplace to refer to contemporary Italy, along with all other ostensibly former imperial nation states, as haunted by its colonial past. The persistence of Italy's particular brand of colonial amnesia results, as many have remarked, from yet another historiographical trope, that of Italian belatedness. While other imperial nation states have gone through more extended processes of post-colonial reckoning, goes the argument, public and academic discourse about colonialism and race only began to take off in Italy in the 1970s and 80s with the publication of groundbreaking histories of Italian colonialism by Giorgio Roscià and Angelo Del Boca, which was followed shortly by the unprecedented immigration to Italy of increasing numbers of racially marked migrants. The so-called Italian postcolonial, a theoretical apparatus that, reductively speaking, seeks to bring together Italy's history as a colonizing emigrant nation with its present as a destination for large numbers of immigrants from the global south, has itself been accused by skeptical critics as a passé, outmoded, or derivative disposition. Once again, its detractors claim Italy has arrived too late. Larson's End of Dreams inspired an evocative footnote in response to such critiques in a recent manifesto by Cristina Lombardi Diop and Caterina Romeo titled The Italian Postcolonial. They write, "The choice of the artist to build the statues using organic material that will deteriorate in these 4 months, as do the bodies of the people who drowned, underlines," they didn't know yet about the storm and the change in the plan. So as do the bodies of the people who drowned, underlines the materiality and the physicality of this daily tragedy. In ways similar to the project of this artist and of many others, we believe that building a theoretical and scholarly framework around the concept of postcoloniality can contribute to keeping alive the memory of those who died and continue to die in the Mediterranean. Close quote. Lombardi, Diop, and Romeo thus align their theoretical and ethical project with that of Larson by drawing a parallel between his commemorative sculptures and the intellectual task of tracking Italy's colonial history and its ongoing reverberations in the present. With few exceptions, Italy does not have a robust anti-colonial cinematic tradition, from Pontecorvo's watershed The Battle of Algiers to lesser-known films such as Jacopetti and Prosperi's shockumentary Africa Addio. It might be safe to say that Italian films about decolonization are most often about someone else's. In her thoughtful essay on Antonioni's 1962 L'Eclipse, Karen Pincus reads the film, despite its utter silence on the topic of Italian colonialism itself, as perhaps, quote, the most eloquent film about Italian decolonization ever made. Pincus argues that, unlike the trauma of decolonization experienced by Britain and France that activated processes of colonial nostalgia, in Italy, decolonization was more of an eclipse, a slinking away, followed by a long period of repression and/or amnesia. Caterina Romeo has referred to Italy's racial unconscious in similarly spectral terms as an evaporation, a discourse that is temporarily invisible, though nevertheless pervasive and always bound to reappear. Gianni Amelio's 1994 Lamerica, which proposes an analogy between post-World War II Italian emigration to Lamerica and contemporary Albanian immigration to Italy, was hailed by several scholars as Italy's first properly post-colonial film, 1994, yet another instance of Italian belatedness. Yet, I want to argue that two films constitute notable exceptions to this cinematic lapse. Yervant Giannikian and Angela Ricci Lucchi's mesmerizing film Dal Polo all'Equatore is arguably as much a film about the material traces of the colonial enterprise as it is about the ideological and as it is about its colonialism's ideological and aesthetic specters. The degraded condition of the film archive of documentarian Luca Comedio's footage from 1898 through the 1920s is foregrounded visually in what Ruth Ben-Ghiat has termed scarred images. Scratches, rips, and chemical dissolution are not mended or restored. They're left as is, even enhanced, in order to serve as a powerful visual metaphor for a collective memory from which the scenes of colonial violence that Comedio's original camera work captured have been torn. The 1986 film, the product of these found fragments, rephotographed with an apparatus that the directors like to call their analytical camera, is slowed down considerably, drawn out to last at least twice as long as the original footage. With the exception of the film's opening credits and dedication to Comerio, quote, words are notable for their absence, as Robert Lumley puts it. Images of unspecified landscapes, people, and animals form from, as the title suggests, the North Pole to the equator, reorganized and color-tinted, at times repeated rhythmically, make up the film's primary content. An eerie ambient score composed by Keith Ulrich and Charles Anderson enhances the meditative trance-like pace of the images passing by on screen. No narrative voiceover or subtitles guide viewers or provide an authoritative take on the reworked images. This lack has led some to, misguidedly in my estimation, critique the film's ultimate aestheticization and commodification of the other. Instead, a powerful making present by staging and drawing out before our eyes lengthy processes of decay, deterioration, amnesia, and absence lies at the heart of this work and most of their work. They're extremely prolific. Like Larson, whose piece seeks to expose the erasure of anonymous migrants from collective memory by deliberately engaging the spectral, that is, by staging the decay and ruin of their sculptural remains and the videographic search for their elusive traces, in Dal Polo, Gianni and Ricciardi also take up haunting as the film's primary aesthetic and ideological mode. Temporality and repetition are key elements of their spectral thought. A dual or even tripartite temporality is inscribed in the film project itself, the historic footage of Comerio's archive, Gianni and Ricciardi's 1984 to 1986 reshooting with their analytical camera, and presumably the future of what they call un senso etico della visione, an ethical sense of viewing or seeing. In addition, the filmmaker's foreground temporality is a hermeneutic. The memorable opening sequence, drawn out from 2 or 3 to roughly 8 minutes in duration, presents viewers with landscapes captured from a moving train. As Lumley has noted, an icon of 19th century modernity's speed, forward movement, and progress, as well as an important symbol of the turn of the 20th century film history to which Comerio's original footage belongs. Gianni and Ricciardi's train moves through a rocky alpine landscape in slow motion, lulling viewers into an altered relationship to both the image and the passage of time. Okay, so this goes on for 8 minutes. We won't watch the whole 8 minutes. Lumley's described the sequence suggesting that time is its subject, along with the act of looking. For Ben-Ghiat, the filmmaker's manipulation of time, quote, might also be taken as exhortations for us to examine the timelines we draw, especially those which allow Italian imperial aggression to be confined only to the years of the fascist dictatorship. We might also hazard that the film anticipates by nearly a decade Homi Bhabha's theorization of postcolonial haunting as a time lag. As a disruptive temporality, the time lag keeps alive the meaning of the past. It provides an alternative way of understanding what constitutes time and fractures the time of modernity. The colonial past is repeated or projected through in the present, and therefore disrupts the continuum of history, those monumental scripts of cultural heritage. Gianni and Ricciardi's film seems to be making a similar claim about a modernity inhabited by colonial specters which disrupt any notion of history as a teleological progression or unfolding. Indeed, Lumley and Scholar have noted that the indebtedness of Gianni and Ricciardi's entire oeuvre to a Benjaminian notion of history as a seizing hold of a memory as it flashes up, a brushing of history against the grain. While Ara Mergian has described their reordering of film fragments as, quote, an unspoken protest against the previous century's inexorability, against a positivism gone wrong. Gianni and Ricciardi's work, Mergian continues, underscores the vagaries of historical time as anachronistic, atavistic, eternally recurrent. If the film stages the time lag through a disruption or a fracture of the time of Western modernity, its decelerated images also serve to re-signify the ethnographic spectacle that Comerio's original camera sought to make plain. Their senso etico della visione is thus instantiated in the slowing down of Comerio's ethnographic impulse. And in so doing, claims Scholar, it restores the humanity of what Comerio's camera had reduced to objects. What were objects of Comerio's gaze, with Gianni and Ricciardi's temporal manipulation, become subjects of a return gaze that implicates the viewer in the voyeuristic act of looking. In describing a tension across their oeuvre between the spectral and the real, between fact and fiction, Mergian has suggested that, quote, the ghostliness of the imagery is more unsettling because of the evident solidity and corpulence of real bodies, objects, and landscapes. A similar tension is at work in Pier Paolo Pasolini's Appunti per un'Orestia de Africana, shot in 1969 and released in 1970. Ostensibly location and character scouting notes, similar to those Pasolini shot in India and Palestine, the film is a montage of spectrally mythopoetic and documentary footage shot in and around Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Kampala, Uganda. The basic project, as Pasolini outlines it in the opening minutes of the film, is a production of Aeschylus's Orestea in an African nation undergoing a transition from colonial rule to formal democracy. Writing about Pasolini's Gospel According to Matthew, 1964, which was also preceded by a similar scouting film shot in Palestine in 1963, Noah Steimatzky argues that these are the central tenets of Pasolini's Poetics of Contamination, one which privileges analogy, displacement, and anachronism over any faithful reconstruction of either mythic source text or contemporary reality. This is where she locates Pasolini's interest in the archaic trace, which takes the form of a, quote, jarring, heterogeneous textuality. Steimatzky describes Pasolini's process in the Gospel and Sopralluoghi in Palestina, which could just as easily apply to the Appunti. Quote, Pasolini embraces both the material concreteness of archaic traces and the grand resonance of myth. Their mutual contamination forms the basis for an adaptation in which the actual and the phantasmatic intersect but do not neutralize each other. It also reflects the oscillation of the cinematic image as such between its photographic realist claim and its amenability to myth. The film can also be situated in the context of what Luca Caminati has termed Pasolini's heretical Orientalist works, punning, of course, on Pasolini's collection of essays, Heretical Empiricism, from 1972. From Oedipus Rex, Medea, and the Arabian Nights, to the screenplay Il Padre Selvaggio, the appeal to UNESCO, Le Mura di Sannà, Along with other location scouting films that I already mentioned, the Appunti constitutes a continuation of Pasolini's experience with the Third World that had officially begun with his trip to India alongside Morante and Moravia in 1961, but arguably can be traced back to his earliest poetry in Friulian dialect, which was precipitated, as he described it, by La scoperta dell'altrove. Both Caminati and Cesare Casarino have cautioned us against reading Pasolini's tiers-mondisme as yet another classic neo-colonial orientalizing gesture, one which ascribes primitivity to an abstract, anonymous Africa and relegates it to a kind of Hegelian prehistory. Instead, in Tanzania and Uganda, as he has had elsewhere, Pasolini uses his camera to seek out traces of the magical, the archaic, the irrational, with the express purpose of placing these traces not into a narrative of inevitable progression, development, or unfolding, but to hold them together in unfinished draft or note form, appunti, drafts for future revision. The temporality of haunting, for Derrida, a holding together of past, present, and future, is underscored thus by the film's very heterogeneous form. The jarring temporality or juxtaposition of contemporary African reality with Aeschylus's ancient text, indeed the West's charter myth for the rule of law and the social contract, according to M.D. Usher, is inscribed in the fragmented nature of the film itself. Furthermore, Pasolini's refrain, repeated time and again throughout the film, "This could be Orestes, Agamemnon, Clytemnestra," distills this condensation of mythic past, present reality, and future promise, as do his notes for a conclusion, which resist any summation and opt instead for suspension between past and present, and a patient, anxious, in his words, march toward the future. As Alessia Ricciardi aptly describes it, quote, "In his poetic encounters with the specters of history, Pasolini encounters not only the revenant of the past, but also the arrivant of the future." We are again, as we were in Dal Polo, dealing with a spectrality that is fundamentally a question of temporality, Baba's time lag or Derrida's time out of joint. Unlike Gianni and Ricciardi, who disrupt colonial modernity's narrative of progress, speed, and conquest through the reassembly of found fragments and the decelerated image, Pasolini proposes instead a disorienting juxtaposition of text, image, and sound, including the erratic, wailing jazz score by Gato Barbieri, Soviet work songs, and a profoundly grating, cringe-inducing, atonal song sung by Yvonne Murray and Archie Savage. All of these sounds make up the film's score. Pasolini's narrative voiceover at times summarizes and at others reads verbatim from Aeschylus's play as possible characters pass before his camera. He repeatedly digresses from a dramatic reading of the text to an almost ethnographic description of the pro-filmic figures, seemingly lapsing distractedly from one register to another. Indeed, this is one of the things that I initially found most troubling about this film. On the one hand, I knew very well that Pasolini had to be aware of the implications that Gianni and Ricciardi's film so eloquently illustrates, the violence that inheres when a white Western man turns his authoritative camera to unnamed silent African natives. The film, in fact, opens with a quite literally self-reflexive gesture. Here I am with the camera reflected in a plate glass window of a shop in an African city, he tells us. On the other hand, I was puzzled by what at first seemed to be lapses into a kind of neo-colonial or ethnographic mode. The opening lines of the film continue, and Pasolini doesn't name the elusive African city, choosing instead to describe it as typical. In fact, Pasolini was conscious of this risk as well, as the film's second section turns to a classroom full of African students at the University of Rome, for whom he screens his footage and explains his project. Their responses are overwhelmingly skeptical. Africa is not a nation, it's a continent. One student feels compelled to clarify, "I don't see the connection." Another remarks, These students, armed with both language and an unequivocally dubious return gaze, use both to throw the project into crisis.
Dai campi alla lettura. Ecco un'aula piena di un silenzio zelante e rispettoso. Gli studenti africani, di fronte al sapere, che gli si presenta sembra ancora come un dono, come una concessione, sono obbedienti, passivi e umili. Per degli appunti, delle note di viaggio, che mi sono servite a bloccare alcune situazioni, alcuni personaggi di quello che dovrebbe essere il mio film sull'Orestiade. Prima di tutto vorrei dirvi perché ho deciso di fare l'Orestiade di Eschilo nell'Africa di oggi. La ragione essenziale, profonda è questa, che mi sembra di riconoscere delle analogie fra la situazione dell'Orestiade e quella dell'Africa di oggi, soprattutto dal punto di vista della trasformazione delle rimni in eumenidi. Cioè mi sembra che la civiltà tribale africana assomiglia alla civiltà arcaica greca e la scoperta che fa Oreste della democrazia, portandola poi nel suo paese, che sarebbe Argo nella tragedia e l'Africa nel nostro film, è in un certo senso diciamo così, la scoperta della democrazia che ha fatto l'Africa in questi ultimi anni. Allora le prime due domande che vorrei farvi sono queste. Secondo voi questo film potrei girarlo nell'Africa di oggi, 1970, oppure sarebbe più adatto, più giusto retrodatare il film e girarlo nell'Africa del 1960, cioè il periodo in cui praticamente la maggior parte degli stati africani hanno acquistato l'indipendenza?
Secondo me, il mio giudizio sarà che questo film avrà molto valore se sarà girato negli anni 60, insomma. Perché oggi l'Africa sta diventando moderna così e sta somigliando un po' all'Europa, sta perdendo un po' del suo proprio carattere tipico africano.
Siete d'accordo con lui?
L'Africa è non è una nazione, ma è un continente.
Sì, ma infatti, ciò che vi chiedo, la prima mia domanda è, secondo voi quando andrebbe ambientata, cioè se nel 70 o nel 60, e in quale luogo? Per esempio lei in quale luogo dell'Africa vedrebbe più tipico per una cosa di questo genere?
Perché io non ho girato l'Africa.
Lei di dov'è?
Etiopia.
E conosce soltanto l'Etiopia?
Sì, ma non è che si deve Africa, dicendo Africa, abbraccia dal Mediterraneo fino all'ultimo punto, e quindi dall'Oceano Atlantico fino all'Oceano Indiano, quindi dire Africa e non è una cosa.
So if Giannikian and Ricciardi use the decelerated image to disrupt colonial-looking relations, in their hands, objects of Comedio's original camera work become subjects, looking back at spectators and illustrating our complicity in the violence of looking. Pasolini stages such a disruption, quite characteristically, as a pedagogical moment. The abrupt cut from the colonial classroom, where students labor in the fields before silently contemplating textbooks imported from Europe, to the University of Rome, might be read as symptomatic of Pasolini's attempt to break with a colonial politics of knowledge through the spectro-cinematic mode of contamination, disjunction, and anachronism that I've been describing. Pasolini will repeat a similar cut later, from inside an empty courtroom in Kampala, with close-ups reading prosecution and defense, and then again to the blank screen at the University of Rome and the classroom, suggesting thus, the final judgment lays in the hands of the students at the university. To illustrate the distinction that I'm trying to make between Giannikian and Ricciardi's and Pasolini's respective spectrotemporalities, and the disjunction or juxtaposition that I'm suggesting characterizes Pasolini's formulation of the time lag, I'd like to consider the effect of the following sequence, drawn from the opening minutes of the film, as Pasolini's disembodied voice recites a summary of the Oresteia of Aeschylus over a series of shots ranging from a ritual performance in the rural countryside to a village cluttered with cars, whose residents wear crisp, white, Western clothing.
Dell'Orestide di Eschilo. La ripeto qui in poche parole e dirò soltanto i fatti. Siamo ad Argo, la città di cui era Agamennone, che sta per tornare da Troia dove è andato a combattere. Sua moglie Clitemnestra lo aspetta, ma è innamorata di un altro uomo che esisto, e lo aspetta dunque con l'intenzione di eliminarlo, di ucciderlo. Agamennone ritorna col suo esercito lacero, stanco, distrutto alla sua città, e Clitemnestra con un inganno lo uccide. Inutilmente Cassandra, la schiava che Agamennone ha portato con sé da Troia, profetizza questo atroce omicidio. Agamennone e Clitemnestra hanno due figli, Oreste e Elettra. Elettra è presente al delitto, Oreste invece è lontano dalla patria, ma quando diventa giovane, quando ha 20 anni, ritorna ad Argo, incontra di nascosto Elettra sulla tomba del padre Agamennone e insieme decidono di vendicarsi. Oreste si presenta sotto false spoglie alla corte di Argo e con un inganno uccide ferocemente sua madre, Clitemnestra. Ma non appena ha ucciso sua madre, ecco che si presentano di fronte a lui le furie, le rinni, le idee del terrore atavico, ancestrale. Oreste fugge, ma lo protegge il dio Apollo. Il dio Apollo lo consiglia di rivolgersi alla dea Atena, che è la dea della democrazia e della ragione, cioè della nuova città di Atene. La dea Atena decide di aiutare Oreste, ma non di aiutarlo, diciamo così, dall'alto, come dea. Vuole aiutarlo facendolo giudicare dagli altri uomini e istituisce così il primo tribunale umano. Questo tribunale umano della democrazia e della ragione assolve Oreste. Le furie vengono trasformate dalla dea Atena, da dee del terrore ancestrale, in dee, diciamo così, dei sogni, dell'irrazionale, che permane accanto alla democrazia razionale del nuovo Stato.
So you'll note that in this sequence, Pasolini's mythic narration only fleetingly lines up with the images on screen, suggesting that he sees his character, Cassandra the slave girl, Orestes as a child, 20-year-old Orestes, and so on. At other times, there's a radically disorienting assemblage of narrated text and image. Further enhancing the disorientation is the desperately seeking mobile camera, whose objects peer back at it, playfully evading capture by its lens. After several shots on location in Tanzania and Uganda, a cut to the African students at the University of Rome presented in the film's opening credits, the only of the anonymous Africans to appear in the credits, creates a further disjunction. A series of close-ups seem to reveal reactions ranging from derision to indifference as Pasolini continues his narration. This unannounced, decontextualized cut to the University of Rome anticipates, without comment, the film's second explicitly self-reflexive sequence that we just watched. Though they do so by radically divergent aesthetic and technical means, both Dal Polo and the Appunti take up cultural belatedness as a critical tool. Rather than a melancholic nostalgia at having arrived too late to an African continent already spoiled by its contact with colonial modernity, a disposition that might inadvertently reproduce that of imperial European travel writing, these films use belatedness to rework its temporal coordinates. By inhabiting belatedness, they refuse imperial teleology, introducing a time lag into the flow of Western modernity. Indicative of this stance by Pasolini is Caminati's claim that the poet-filmmaker deliberately eschews the nomenclature of the developing world, preferring to cling heretically to the term third world. This is indicative of his rejection of teleological time, be it imperialist or Marxist, according to which pre-capitalist countries necessarily had to pass through a phase of capitalism before turning to socialism. Interestingly, and perhaps critically, neither of these films are explicitly or even explicitly about the Italian postcolonial. They point to a more wide-reaching, dare I say, universalist model of postcolonial critique that refuses to respect the geopolitical boundaries imposed by imperial nationalism. Their very titles speak to this refusal. Giannichian and Ricciardi's resignifying of Commerio's original title, From the Pole to the Equator, delivers none of the all-encompassing tour of imperial spoils that its original title promised. Instead, turned on its head, it maps Western imperialism's slow, corrosive, peripatetic march around the globe, illustrating, rather than mastery, its inherent violence. Gianni and Ricciardi's 2013 Paese Barbaro will address Italian fascism empire more directly. Pasolini's title, like the project it describes, deracinates and resituates the origins of Western democracy in modern Africa, at once defamiliarizing the Western canon and overturning the topos of Italian primitivity, African primitivity, into one of future possibility that critically contains without neutralizing the archaic trace. Scholars of the Italian postcolonial who are eager to refute the paradoxically imperialist politics of yet another topos of Italian belatedness, this time of Italianists to the field of postcolonial studies, which has been declared dead, particularly in the light of the decolonial thought of Chiano and Mignolo, might therefore take a cue from Pasolini and Gianni and Ricciardi, whose films, like Larson's piece with which we began, compel us to heed the specter. That's it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to take some questions?
Sure.
Great.
Comments, suggestions.
I haven't read, I've read some of other, Caminati's other stuff, which I found very good, so I haven't read Orientalismo Eretico, but, so I'm not sure if he addresses this, but I do remember when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, talking to, Harsha Ram, who's in the Slavic Center, and I remember, it was when I was just sort of discovering Pasolini further, and I remember his telling me that, Pasolini had been his hero intellectually and culturally until he picked up The Scent of India, and then Un mito si è colato, basically. That for him it was this, it was a missed opportunity that this person that he had kind of lionized and heroized seemed prey to the same kind of facile, in some ways exploitation of the East as some of the other great luminaries that unfortunately kind of did the same thing. And how do you, because these films I am far less sort of familiar with and have studied far less intimately, and I still don't know the extent. I mean, the way I always see it is that there does seem to be in some ways this fetishization of the third world in the same way that the Borgata is kind of fetishized as this as you put it, this kind of Hegelian prehistory, because it's the only space not contaminated by capitalist logic, right? And in some ways for Pasolini's, for that kind of, that subjectivity spared the contaminating, corrosive aspects of capitalism, it has to be this kind of almost primitive space, right? I mean, so what do we do with that? I mean, I've always found even his approach to the Borgata is deeply problematic to the extent that it does reject this even Marxist kind of notions of working class solidarity, and I mean there is a projection of on his behalf, no matter how subconscious, and it's interesting that I think it's great that you staged that self-conscious moment, because I think far more than others he is self-conscious about it, but it does still seem problematic, and I want to hear your thoughts on how we might. What do we do with that? It's a huge question.
Yeah, well, so this is the question that animates me. Like, this is why I keep coming back to this film. So I first saw it with really uninformed eyes and was shocked, horrified, like disgusted, confused, and it was kind of risible. I didn't, and so that's sort of what I'm trying to do is like. So I spent a while on the Harsha Ram train, feeling the same way, feeling, especially when I read the Scent of Profumo, cos'è? Profumo dell'India, l'odore, and then what is it? Then Moravia writes of the same. So they're on the same trip, and Moravia writes l'idea dell'India. So Caminati has a beautiful little anecdote about. to get at the distinction between Moravia's and Pasolini's approach to this disruption of teleological time that I was trying to talk about in Marxist terms. You can read these two books and you can see this shift where Moravia is a more convinced, more traditional Marxist insofar as he sees necessarily a development, a capitalist development happening in India in order to get to the socialist moment. And Pasolini, according to Caminati, and I haven't reread these two texts to verify it, but this is his claim. So I kind of like that. So in L'odore dell'India, as objectionable as it can be and as totally neo-orientalizing and fetishizing, my friend Sylvia wrote a really beautiful article about the trauma of India, the trauma of difference, that you should read. It's great. On Pasolini's L'odore dell'India. What was my point? So anyway, the idea, I don't know. My answer is I don't know. But, yeah.
I thought I was thinking about this a lot, and I think that there's on the ideological level, there's a very good analysis in Antonio Negri and Megawart's Multitude, two Italians in India, which is an analysis of these two books from Moravia and Pasolini, by the way, from 61, 62, it's very early. So this is much later. I think it's also important to see that there's this less naivety there.
Yeah.
But what is problematic in Negri and Hart is that they read this just as political philosophers on an ideological level. So they read whatever they displaces that for Pasolini everything is the same in India under conditions of capitalism. For Moravia everything is different under conditions of spirituality. So it's basically their argument. And this is of course ideological narrowness, political orientalism. But what I think is the potential in Pasolini then, as at least later, for example, also in the Moda di Sana art, is that the images, since they create something, they create allegories, for example, or they create figures, cannot be read this way ideological. They have to be read in a different way, and thereby or cannot be defined in an ideological way if there are if there's something in them which goes beyond this, what it does in L'odore dell'India.
And so what do you mean, by not reading them ideologically, what would be the alternative then?
I have a hard time understanding what that would be.
Do not read them ideologically.
Yeah.
Read them, for example, also deconstructively.
Aesthetically.
For example, like the Moda di Sana, I can give an example with the Moda di Sana, where it starts with a temple, a Chinese temple, financed aid there in Yemen, in Asia, and then there's the landscape, also what Andreas Stamatsky analyzes, the landscape, which is also so there's also the landscape, the analytic landscape, and then there's this cornerstone of memory in the Moda di Sana, and so these allegories are resistant. They're resistant like poetry. I was thinking at the beginning of your talk, I was thinking of the poem by Pasolini, Alidali of Yatsuri. It's also not that you can explain the poem because it rests to be striking and.
Well, I guess my point though is that the raw material, whether it be the subjects of the Borgata and it's somewhat different in those films because he's actually using non-professional actors from the Borgata themselves, like Ricciardi and others, right? But in this instance, it's the raw material itself, however allegorical or poetic it is still a projection from a European white director onto the supposedly prehistoric kind of material. So it's still. I mean, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. I want him.
That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
Because like I said, anyway, and I feel like this is a way for me. This is how I was able to come to terms with this film. Pretty much was by thinking of it in terms of this, by thinking of it in the temporal terms and in the terms of this kind of suspension and Right? So the prehistorical not as something that would inevitably get wrapped up in the development of, but there is a residue of,
And you address that, I mean, it's important to, but I know,
Yeah, just thinking from the other side. I mean, I'm part of the problematic liberalism camp, at least for now. And I just wrote something for Rebecca on petroleum feminism. And she gave me puzzling for the future, let's say Ricciardi article, which didn't really convince me. But I like your talk because it's challenging me. Because I just hadn't considered this film as much, and I am starting to try to rethink. And so rather than thinking about the treatment of the past, you said a little bit about the future, which is something that I've never really been able to recoup in any puzzling ever.
a future.
except as a bleak kind of gradual succumbing to capitalism.
Yeah.
Well, that's how this one ends precisely with this refusal, the refusal to gradually, right? So the tragic conclusion of Accatone, of Mamma Roma. I mean, this is the appunti, and so the idea is precisely not to have a conclusion, but the final shots are, men. What is this called? What is this action? Hoeing the earth, and a leaving open of a future. And it really did. It feels to me like this is not the future of the inevitable march of capitalism across the African continent, and that's why he chose Tanzania. It was the historical reasons were they had just elected a socialist president, so it was the first post-colonial president, a socialist, and so he was really curious about is this possible? Is it possible to see a future that doesn't necessarily take us through the hell of capitalism?
More along the petroleum, which is collection of
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the same way in which
Mhm.
it's formed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In the same way in which it's that there's some morality. Got me.
Oh, good.
It also reminded me another film, the Comizi d'amore,
Mm-hmm.
in which by the way there's Moravia,
Yeah. As the psychologist, the psychoanalyst.
It's the third pole. There is the Borgate, there's the India. Then in Comizi d'amore we have southern Italy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it functions exactly
Mhm.
the same way because
Mhm.
there's a very straight line dividing the north and the
Mhm.
using the north and in the south. And then there's this moment with Moravia and Pasolini drawing the
Yeah.
So
Giovanna Trento has a really nice article on the pan-meridione, on Pasolini's pan-meridionalismo, which brings together precisely this. And her stuff is interesting because it's trying, and I'm a little conflicted about it. It's trying to situate Pasolini at the origins of postcolonial thought in Italy, an Italian postcolonial thought, while accommodate a kind of version of Pasolini as somebody who, in his travels to Eritrea in the 60s for the filming of Le Mille e Una Notte, is explicitly talking in the 1960s about Italian colonialism, about the circulation of popular memory, and about his reception, his approach to Eritreans as informed by colonial propaganda. So Trento wants to say, okay, look, here we have a nice acknowledgement of the function of post-colonial memory in Pasolini. On the other hand, this pan meridione suffers from the same kinds of symptoms that Ara outlined with his treatment of India. So the very same essays about Eritrean women are just like la grazia degli Eritrei, and so Trento is trying to kind of reconcile these two tensions, right? So his indebtedness to a kind of 19th century colonial description of Eritrea with this acknowledgement in the 60s, this kind of early acknowledgement, late if you think about Gramsci as the true origin, right, of post-colonial thought.
Okay, so the first film that I've ever seen that was reading was Oedipus Rex,
Mm-hmm.
which again has this allusion to ancient
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
sort illustrate all that's wrong with this legacy of social media fascism. And here, again, we have an allusion to ancient Greece with Aeschylus
Mm-hmm.
to narrate a problem that has nothing to do with ancient Greece. So I'm wondering if you could help me figure out why does it keep going back to ancient Greece of all places to explain problems of the so-called third world?
That's a really good question. That's a tough one. I can give you like the most like historiographical kind of explanation. I guess he was doing, or this is more like biographical. At least his turn to Aeschylus is, he was working on translations for stage theatrical productions with like Vittorio Gassman, and came across, so there's this classicist M.D. Usher, who you might be, who will be able to tell you more about it than I can. Yeah, his article talks about how Pasolini discovered the Orestes and like why Aeschylus's text in particular.
It's translated Greek since high school, so it's not a discovery for him. It's something he was familiar with. He was a great translation back when he was 16.
Well, to the extent that everyone does it for classical.
Exactly.
Sorry, I meant that so this classicist's reading, that I'm quoting, has this episode in the 1960s as he's doing this translation for Gassman, where he discovers a Marxist reading of Aeschylus through a British, Thompson, George Thompson. Yes, and so this guy who's done that, who's asked precisely that question, has actually gone back to the Thompson text and has pulled out descriptions of Africa or of Athens, Aeschylus in Athens, that would have immediately resonated with Pasolini's attempt to do a Marxist reading here.
I actually read that Usher article.
Uh-huh.
The paper, and my understanding of the response to Mitchell's question is that Pasolini saw a corollary in the developing democracy of Africa that was parallel to Greece.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Greece, and then the tribal derivatives
Mm-hmm.
evolving.
Mm-hmm. Into the civil, yeah. That's this one. I can't tell. I mean, this is just this one case, right? But as far I don't know. Does anybody else have any thoughts? There's bigger Pasolini scholars in the house than I am.
I think Pasolini has theoretically the sexual orientalism in a theoretical point because it's at the same time complex and problematic. Because your question with the subproletarian figures, it becomes therefore more problematic, but also it's still interesting. But
Well, it's an ennobling in a sense, right, of this kind of third world. It's a trope, it becomes a trope of kind of suggesting. Well, one other thing I was going to say is that I mean you mentioned Gramsci, and it's interesting to think of just reading that Spivak interview on Gramsci and how he was so important to the subaltern studies group because he had located a logic outside of capital, and yet it would be interesting to see what she would think of Pasolini, because I always think of so for example the parallel for me with Pasolini is this idea of there are some leftists and post-structuralists who want to decenter the subject, right, and there are a lot of people for who never had a full subjectivity or granted a full voice and subjectivity to be decentered to begin with.
Mhm.
So it ignores in a sense that identity politics of wait a minute, as a
Who
as a
had
black
access to
woman.
full subjectivity,
Exactly.
right, yeah.
So and I think of a similar thing with Pasolini's relationship to Marxism, which is that he, labor for him can't be in any way, class solidarity and labor is not his model in a sense. So I talked to Brian about this in the past, and that I still grapple with what exactly was, how do we figure Pasolini's Marxism to the extent that, okay, so the Borgata is an alternative to the hell of capitalism. But does that, and he says, like, what am I supposed to do with these millions of people in the post-war who are living in concentration camps, basic
Mhm.
virtual concentration camps, ignore them?
Mhm.
But at the same time, I feel like that there is a kind of almost glorification of that alterity of the
Mhm.
Borgata. And what if those people actually do want to be not just sub-proletariat, but proletariats and have jobs? I mean, yeah, I mean, and look how it ends, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it's in some ways, I guess what I'm saying is that, what if, these Africans did in fact want to develop? And
Well, that's what these colloquy,
Yeah.
right? That's what the
Underscore,
fruit of
right?
them,
Yeah.
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 And so, right? Sorry, go ahead. No, please. I was just going to ramble.
I saw the anthem that was playing
Mhm.
through as a sort of a
Mhm.
Marxist frame, and I wondered if anybody knew exactly what that. I couldn't find it.
I tracked it down once and then promptly forgot it, and I've since read it referred to as Soviet work songs. Yeah, it's Soviet work song, but I actually had like I once upon a time I knew the actual titles. Yeah.
Maybe we could take one more question. Yes.
Another question about my chemistry. Maybe after the I am a Japanese translator covering poetry. Yeah, I published all the big books several years ago.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And also I don't know if you can just say now in books in Salò, Professor in Derrida University. I give you some comments. So the first contact of Pasolini with Africa is that in the wartime that he sent his first book, poetry, to Kenya. You know that?
I didn't know that. No.
You know that in Italy, generally speaking, you can imagine the relation between Tripoli or Addis Ababa, Ethiopia and Italy was more important in the wartime. But Pasolini, he never mentioned about Ethiopia or Libya, but to Kenya. Because his father, his fascist father, was a hostage in the British army camp. Yeah. And he sent his first book, poetry, written not in Italian, but Pugliese. His mother is, the Susanna, recently published a very big book of history of the family, but Susanna was a Pugliese, and then, Pasolini studied the Pugliese language, and declared that he wished to be a Stefan Mallarmé in Pugliese language. He invented the Eclipse, scripture in Pugliese language, how to write Pugliese in alphabet, and he changed 3 times in his life, his poetry. He didn't start his career as an Italian poet, brilliant poet. And after 10 years, and then he went to Rome to start writing Italian poetry. This is the important thing, that his father, fascist father, was a general, leading or something, and then he was caught in the British army in Italy. And then that person was a Postcolonial, novel. And he could not understand Pugliese. And then, so Pier Paolo studied how to write or how to invent Pugliese, according to the mother. And then his first book to Kenya. Of course, his father could not read it.
Oh, so he said to his father.
His father, who was the prisoner of war.
When we think of the case of Edipo, in case of Edipo, the film, the important thing is not mentioning or adaptation of the book, but of the Zigmund Freud. He was Pier Paolo was a very figure student of Zigmund Freud. And you remember the first scene. The problem is psychopath, and living for baby, psychopath, and it foretells his blindness in the drama. And so, what happened to his father? Could you imagine that? The fascist father receiving the very language his son could pretend read. Only Pier Paolo and the mother could share, enjoy reading. That's the beginning of Pasolini's career. And so, in 1964 was second, he frequently visited Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, not to Ethiopia or Libya. It's very interesting. And then he wrote a very interesting line in the Religione in Immigrant,
Unica mia alternativa. Mhm.
Yeah, that's it.
Frammento alla morte, 1958, right?
This period of the theory,
Mm-hmm.
after theory,
Mhm.
theory is gone, Africa appeared.
Mhm. Mm-hmm.
And then she, tried to, according to my prejudice, to decompose the so-called Hegelian history. She put the idea that Greek was the beginning of civilization. He picked up his translated the purpose and shoots this plot line in Wazazad and Sadura in Morocco using Japanese music. That's very evident. So I think sometimes I think that, priori, Italia, the language Italia is very new invention. Only less than 200 years. Before there are so many dialects or another language to use in Afrikaans, Korean, so many languages. And priori, just in the wartime, what does it mean to speak or write priori in the wartime of pacifism? Pacifism, passion means binding one thing, and there's no room for, research in the priori language or Napolitan.
Mm.
Only writing priori is means against pacifism. And that's very important thing, that the Japanese couldn't do these kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
But particularly Pier Paolo did it. And that's very good, very important thing. To study or to learn mother's language, it means to do against pacifism.
I was going to say, to get back to the also to the question before of why I think in some ways also in Medea there's the use of, I can't remember the name of the music, but that very primitive screeching and at the beginning, especially
Mhm,
the sacrificial,
mhm.
right? I mean, in some ways I think it's this desire to get back to the primitivism of even the cradle of Western culture, right?
Mhm.
The idea that, I mean, it's not quite, what's the famous study on it's like African and female, basically sort of the African roots of Hellenic culture. I can't
Mhm.
remember the first title, but basically the idea that this sort of pre-Periclean Athens was this primitive kind of, and I think that gets to the heart of his kind of contamination, right?
Mhm,
That
mhm.
strategy of contamination,
Mhm.
and maybe contamination as a kind of physical interweaving gets in some ways at your point about temporal kind of synchronicity and contamination.
Mhm. Mhm.
But the one thing I was going to say last, do you have time for maybe before
Sure.
is that how if at all would you situate, because there are, with the presence of American jazz and stuff, there is this whole project of Pasolini's, and he has some very deeply problematic associations of himself with, at various times he says like, I am a Negro, I've been lynched like a Negro, stuff like that. So this identification with the American black,
Mhm. Mhm.
as if it's interchangeable in some
Mhm.
ways with Africa. Do you have
Well,
any-
other than the fact that this was the larger project, right?
Right.
The poema scritti per un poema sul terzo mondo,
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
supposed to have a Harlem component.
Right, right.
And so again, kind of this lumping together, a kind of Pan-Africanism, but a
Yeah.
problematic one. Other than that, that Usher article has that cool anecdote about RFK, it's bizarre. I mean, that anyway. I recommend this article. So, yeah. So, M.D. Usher. He's at the University of Vermont, and he's a classicist. But anyway, he found this speech from RFK. From maybe 2 years prior, citing the Oresteia, and so thinks that maybe Pasolini somehow would have gotten word of that, or for him, or that at least for RFK there was this. It was a speech. It was a kind of civil rights speech of Kennedy, just before he was assassinated, and so he had drawn this connection between the American black. And so Usher kind of speculates that maybe Pasolini had that it was in the air, that it was through that he had this connection, that he made this ulterior connection. Thank you, guys.